Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a really dense document. It's basically laying out this big vision, a blueprint almost, for rebuilding things from the community level up. You sent over this source. It's pretty complex, talking about a holistic model, right? Aiming to fix how wealth moves or doesn't move and boost national growth. And the focus is, interestingly, on behavior and community capital.
That's right. Yeah, it's ambitious stuff. We're looking at parts of a document called theorydiscussion.pdf, and it tries to mesh two worlds that usually stay very separate. On one hand, you've got high return capital funds, how to manage them, scale them. And on the other, these really deep social dignity programs. The source uses this phrase, helping the little girls in alleys to capture that human element.
Okay, so our mission here is to figure out how this framework thinks it can actually pull this off, going from just, creating funds and companies to something much bigger, generating super confidence, boosting GDP, and basically redesigning the social safety net. That's a massive undertaking. So where do they even start? Why this need for such a radical approach?
Well, it kicks off with their diagnosis of the core problem, wealth misallocation. The argument in the source is that money moves fast, sure, but only within very tight circles. Capital flows around Wall Street, private equity, municipal debt, these high-return loops, but it rarely breaks out to reach the neighborhoods, the people who need investment the most. Those alleyways where dignity is lost, as they put it. The system works, but only if you're already inside that loop.
Right. So just pumping more money into the same old pipes won't fix it. The system itself is the issue, and their solution hinges on behavioral science. That seems like a leap.
It does, but that's central to their argument. They believe behavior is the real driver of outcomes, maybe even more than capital itself. Things like confidence, trust, earned trust, specifically in active collaboration, they see these as economic multipliers, not just nice-to-haves. So the idea is if you can use behavioral design, maybe at the micro level, say in a neighborhood group or a startup team, to fix behaviors like distrust or lack of cooperation.
Then you unlock potential.
Exactly. You unlock this latent energy, this velocity and productivity that then ripples out across the whole macro system.
Okay, and this thinking fuels their investment model, this smart founders model.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through that? What do these funds and deal rooms actually do?
So it starts pretty conventionally. They set up deal rooms, investment funds. The goal is efficiency, connecting the right introducers, investors, and operators smoothly. Standard stuff. But here's the twist. The companies they create have this dual mandate. They have to be profit machines, yes, and they have to function as learning centers, almost like labs for human behavior.
Labs. What are they testing?
They're designed explicitly to test and measure what makes individuals and teams, well, more cooperative, more accountable, more productive over the long haul. They're trying to quantify the impact of culture and structure.
So what kind of things are they actually measuring? Like cooperation scores, how do you even track that?
They're trying to turn those soft skills into hard data points, measuring things like follow-through rates on promises made internally, or how fast diverse teams solve problems together, adherence to shared values, things like that. And this data isn't just collected. It feeds back into the model itself, constantly tweaking the rules, the incentives. That's how they claim it moves beyond just hoping wealth trickles down.
And that links to the other side of the coin, the direct dignity impact, the human layer. This sounds like the counterbalance to the pure finance focus.
It absolutely is. This is where that commitment to dignity, the little girls in alleys, comes in directly. The programs are designed to bypass typical bureaucracy, get mentorship, safe spaces, food, even microcapital straight into the hands of people who are often overlooked. Single moms, kids in tough spots. And this isn't separate from their bigger picture. It's integrated with their, let's say, political ambition. This upgrade they call Social Security 2.0.
Okay, Social Security 2.0, that sounds revolutionary. Probably pretty controversial. How would that work? What's the link between getting security and having to participate?
Well, instead of just a guaranteed check, no strings attached, this vision ties security directly to participating in these community capital structures. So maybe that means being active in a neighborhood incubator, or helping manage a local microfund, or doing mentorship rotations. It's framed as hand up with accountability.
Mm-hmm.
The behavioral angle is key here. The goal is to reinforce productive, trusting behaviors by making engagement the pathway to security rather than just passive receipt.
Right, so the underlying logic is if people feel secure because they're actively contributing and being held accountable and they see others doing the same, that builds a deep shared confidence. And that confidence isn't just a feeling, it becomes a tangible economic driver.
That's precisely the argument. They talk about creating super confidence at scale. When people feel secure and see opportunity linked to responsibility, they're more likely to spend, to take calculated risks, to invest in local businesses and ideas. This increased velocity of money, combined with local trust, is meant to scale up, from community funds influencing local prosperity all the way up to impacting state and national economic health. The idea is to re-anchor the whole economy's trust at that neighborhood level.
It's a really integrated vision. High finance meets grassroots dignity. But wow, any system trying to reinvent both capitalism and the welfare state is going to face some serious pushback. What's interesting is the source material seems ready for that. It anticipates the criticisms. So what are the main attacks they expect?
Yeah, they definitely try to get ahead of it. The first and maybe most fundamental challenge goes right back to that core idea, behavioral science. Critics, they predict, will just call it social engineering in disguise. Too paternalistic. The argument would be that it's overreaching, trying to rewire people's behavior, manage their choices, instead of just letting markets and individuals figure things out. Human psychology is just too messy, too complex, critics say, to be the foundation for national policy.
Okay, fair enough. And what about the mechanisms, these deal rooms, the funding structures? Isn't that just creating another exclusive club?
That's another big one. Critics might dismiss the Smart Founders deal rooms as, yeah, another networking club. Maybe it helps the people already savvy enough to get in, but does little for those truly on the margins. And there's a deeper ethical concern they flag, this mixing philanthropy with profit. Is it genuinely trying to do good, or is it just capitalism wearing a moral mask? Potentially even entrenching private control over things that should be public welfare and maybe benefiting the insiders who design the system.
Let's zero in on that huge political risk. Social Security 2.0. If you're swapping out a guaranteed safety net for something conditional on participation, that sounds like introducing massive uncertainty for the most vulnerable people. How does the critique frame that specific risk?
It frames it exactly like that, replacing a guarantee with risk. Critics worry it swaps out that essential safety net, the bedrock, for what they call risky experiments, experiments tied to behavioral compliance or the success of local initiatives. And a key part of this critique is the danger of local capture. The argument is that historically, community-run funds or incubators can sometimes get mismanaged or worse, taken over by local elites. So the capital ends up benefiting the connected few, and the truly vulnerable, the ones who maybe can't easily participate, get left behind by the complexity.
And lastly, those big economic claims, super confidence, GDP multipliers. What's the pushback from economists?
They likely dismiss those claims as, hand-waving marketing talk, essentially, lacking hard, measurable economic proof. Plus, there's a critical ethical point raised. Even if you do manage to grow GDP this way, does that automatically mean more dignity? Less poverty? Better equality? There's a real risk. The whole thing just becomes another top-down mechanism focused on aggregate numbers, not actual human well-being.
Okay, that's a pretty comprehensive list of potential pitfalls, but the compelling part, as you said, is how the framework responds. It doesn't just brush off the critics, it seems to absorb their points to build a more nuanced case. So let's get into their structured response. How do they counter that social engineering charge?
Their response is pretty pragmatic. They basically say, look, incentives already shape our behavior constantly. Every market, every political system has rules that guide what we do. The goal isn't to script behavior from scratch, but to design fairer rules of the game, to shift the incentives so that things like shared responsibility and earning trust become the most rational and even profitable choices for people.
Right, that's where they bring in game theory, isn't it? The idea that if the system consistently rewards collaboration and thinking long term.
Exactly. People will adapt. They'll start believing in those values again because they see them working. They see that playing by these rules means everyone, including themselves, gets more chips in the long run, so to speak. It's about moving from just transactional integrity, doing the bare minimum, to what they call active integrity, stepping up, committing, following through reliably.
Okay, and how do they tackle the networking club criticism, the idea that these deal rooms are just exclusive?
They actually lean into the networking aspect, but they reframe it using anthropology. They agree, yes, it is networking, but they argue humans need these third places,
Yeah.
Beyond home, first place, and work, second place. You need these other spaces historically, the pub, the town square, the community center where social capital gets built.
So the deal rooms are positioned as intentionally designed third spaces, not just random mingling, but curated for building trust and shared goals.
Precisely. Designed to make essential business functions, like recruiting talent, vetting suppliers, even long-term sales, much more efficient because you're starting from a baseline of pre-vetted trust and shared understanding.
Okay, and that connects to pushing back against the idea that values are just fluffy words in business.
Right. They counter that by citing actual research. They mention big names, McKinsey, the Department of Defense, Google, pointing to studies showing that values aren't optional extras. They're operational necessities. Things like accountability, clear communication, integrity, shared responsibility. The research suggests these are the core building blocks of the most resilient, most effective, and often most profitable organizations. Values are like the physics of good organization.
That definitely shifts the perspective. Values become measurable drivers of performance, not just moral guidelines. But what about the tendency for wealth and connections to cluster? That old proverb, a wealthy man has many friends. How do they address that reality?
They acknowledge it directly. Wealth does tend to attract connections and opportunities,
Yeah.
but they want to redefine wealth. Their argument is that responsibility should have a direct link to earning wealth. But wealth shouldn't just mean dollars. It also means access, status, connections. The system they envision aims to reward that active integrity we talked about, so that wealth in all its forms flows to those who demonstrably step up, follow through, deliver quality. And crucially, making that process transparent and measurable. That's their attempt to ensure that demonstrated responsibility can actually outweigh just having inherited access or connections.
This is where it gets really fascinating, I think. Moving beyond just the internal logic and critiques to the bigger picture, we've seen how they handle internal challenges. But what if the entire external system, the macroeconomy, hits a wall? The framework seems to build in this layer of, well, realism about just how fragile traditional currency can be.
Yeah, this part is quite striking. They incorporate this deep realism about money itself. Modern fiat currency, they note, isn't backed by gold. It relies purely on government authority and collective belief or confidence. And if that confidence disappears, or if, say, some global event triggers a systemic collapse of trust in traditional finance, they even mention scenarios like digital asset manipulation or mass debt cancellation. Well, in that kind of chaos, just having dollars in a bank account might not be enough.
So the argument becomes that the real function of this local system they're building is resilience, a buffer against those kinds of global shocks. They're still aiming for financial returns, clearly, but the deeper purpose is creating something else.
Exactly. It's about prioritizing what they call story value. That's their term for local, non-monetary wealth. Things you can actually verify in your community. Access to people you trust, sanity, stable relationships, accountability you can see. This relational wealth, knowing you can rely on your neighbor, your local suppliers, that becomes the crucial foundation if the bigger systems wobble. The local capital and dignity network is designed to keep communities functioning, even if global finance goes haywire. Although, they are careful to add a dose of realism.
Oh, what's the caveat?
They caution that while local trust is powerful, it doesn't magically pay for imported goods or, complex modern healthcare. It's a vital buffer, a complementary form of wealth, not a total replacement for broader economic systems.
Okay, that makes sense. And maybe the strongest sign of confidence in any theory is its willingness to say how it could be wrong. They don't present this as a perfect, guaranteed solution, do they? They actually list ways their own vision could fail.
Yes, and that's crucial for credibility, I think. It shows a certain humility. They explicitly state conditional claims, things that, if they happened, would undermine their model. They know, for instance, that just having incentives and value statements on paper guarantees nothing. They point to history, Enron, FTX, as examples of values drift.
Values drift.
Yeah, where the initial good intentions and stated values get abandoned, maybe for short-term gain, unless you have really rigorous, constant enforcement mechanisms built right into the system's governance.
And they also circle back to that political vulnerability we talked about earlier, local capture.
They do. They acknowledge the historical risk that community-run funds can be mismanaged or taken over by local elites. This means the most vulnerable communities, the ones who need it most, could actually be left further behind unless there's, say, mandated professional oversight or external auditing for these community funds. They
Yeah.
recognize that risk is very real.
And finally, systemic barriers. The idea that life isn't always fair.
Right. They admit that even with their system, responsibility won't always perfectly correlate with financial success because things like discrimination, systemic biases, or just plain bad luck. And they also concede that any system based on transparency can, at least theoretically, be gamed by clever actors.
So, okay, if we pull all of that together, the grand vision, the critiques, the nuanced responses, the self-acknowledged potential failures, what does it mean for those big claims about national GDP and superconfidence? Where does that leave us?
Well, the sharpened takeaway seems to be this. The core idea, the structural alignment piece, is probably sound. But those national-level claims about massive GDP growth and widespread superconfidence, those have to be seen as conditional. They need to be presented as aspirational goals, things they hope to achieve,
Hmm.
until there's hard, verifiable data showing that the behavioral shifts they foster actually translate into measurable economic velocity at scale.
So the immediate provable value isn't necessarily transforming the entire national economy overnight?
Perhaps not immediately. The more grounded value proposition seems to be in creating these robust local engines, engines of both dignity and capital. Well-governed engines that demonstrably build that buffer of local trust and resilience.
Right. So the debate isn't really idealists versus cynical realists. It's more about structural design. Can you actually create systems where being responsible, ensuring dignity, and driving growth all pull in the same direction instead of constantly being in tension?
Exactly. The whole system seems designed to make visible and then reward the things that already work in the best teams and communities. Responsibility builds wealth, and wealth, when it's clearly tied to demonstrated responsibility, builds the trust you need for stability and long-term prosperity.
Which brings us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to consider. If we accept the premise that traditional fiat currency is fundamentally fragile, based only on collective confidence that can be shaken, then how much more secure, potentially, is an economic underpinning based partly on local capital, yes, but also on this measurable, non-monetary story value? This local access to trust, responsibility, sanity, things that global financial shocks can't easily manipulate or erase. So the question to mull over is, what practical steps could you take right now in your own life or community to start measuring and actively investing in that kind of intangible story value?